Hello and welcome to Alyssa Jean's Reviews. Welcome to my Star Trek Top 100, where I now enter the top 25. So the first portion of my top 25 will be 25 through 11 in the month of August, but it's being split up into two videos. So this is part one of that. I'm going to cover 25 through 18 in this video, and then 1 week from the release date of this video, which is August 11th, is the first release for this video. 1 week from that, August 18th, I will release the next portion, which will be numbers 17 through 11. And then in September, we get into the top 10, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We're now entering the top 25. This is the top quarter of my top 100, and this is really the best of the best when you look at all 700, 800 Star Trek episodes that there are. Now, of course, when I say that, I mean the best of the best by my opinion, and my opinion alone, and nothing else. In fact, there are going to be some episodes that I talk about in this very video that will not be popular choices for top 25s, where most other people would not put certain episodes in their top 25, but I do not care. This is, for me, the best of the best. And I think anyone who does a top 25, it's always going to look different than anyone else's top 25. I look at my brother, for an example, Mark on Enchantment of Eternity. He is in the process of doing his top 25 1 month at a time, and he has me and usually Darren or Don come on and do a discussion about each one 1 month at a time. And he is going to do his number 20 this month, and thus far, up to his number 20, none of them are the same as mine. Although all of the ones that he picked are episodes that I like, most of them fall in my 50 through 26 range, so they're still high up, Chief of Operations. They're high up there, but not quite top 25 for me. And I have a feeling that most of the episodes that I will talk about will probably be the same for him, where, okay, maybe that didn't make his top 25, but he still thinks highly of them. And I think that may be the case for other people as well. There may be some episodes on here. I'm thinking my number 25 is coming up shortly that some people will be like, no way would that be anywhere near my top 25. But that's okay. That's what is the beauty of Star Trek, is that we all have our own perceptions, our own opinions based on our own experience, but we can all still join in the love and appreciation of this franchise. So without further ado, let's get into my top 25. We'll get in, as I said, 25 through 18 will be in this video. Let's start us off with the big number 25.
Number 25.
Okay, here it is, my number 25, and it comes from Star Trek Voyager, and it is one that a lot of other people, most other people, wouldn't have in their top 25, but I don't care. My number 25 from Star Trek Voyager's second season is Deadlock. This episode, to me, has always been one of my favorites. I have loved this episode from the very first time that I saw it. And much like with my number 26, my previous video, which was Nemesis, it is one that I didn't discover until later that a lot of people trash it and don't like it, and I was shocked because I have always had a great love for this episode. And I will get into kind of the detractors a little bit later on in this review. But first, I just kind of want to talk about my love for this episode. And also, I want to mention once again that I just always seem to love the Voyager episodes that a lot of other people aren't huge fans of, either think they suck or just in most cases think they're kind of mediocre or okay. And some episodes that people do love, I either hate or think are okay. Like Dark Frontier, Tuvix are two that get a lot of love and attention that I think are awful. And I think of Tinker Tenor Doctor Spy gets a lot of love. I don't think it's awful. I think it's fine. I put it on my overrated episode list. And I think that's the case. The Thal's another one that I love that other people just think is okay. Like, so I have a lot of this opposite reaction to Voyager than the general fandom. Now, that is not true of any of the episodes that are in my top 15. I have 3 Voyager episodes in my top 15, and all of those I think are generally well loved. But in the case of a lot of other Voyager episodes, my opinion seems to be contrary to the general fandom for whatever reason, and this is one of them. I love how this episode starts off so dire, and I've talked about in previous entries of Voyager when they've entered my top 100. I've talked about how I don't think Voyager was dire enough. I think it was too clean and neat for being cut off from their main source. They're being cut off from the Federation, that things should have been a lot more dire. So I always appreciate when they show things being really dire. Right off the top, baby Naomi dies. Harry Kim goes flying out into space. You're like, what? And you know that's not going to stick. But I mean, that seems like a pretty final death. He's like, you went flying. I mean, that's shocking. Harry Kim went flying up into space. What the fuck? So I loved that this episode hooked me right from the beginning. And then once we get the concept that there's these 2 Voyagers that existed together, I personally thought that was absolutely fascinating. Again, I'll get to the detractions a little bit later and address the detractors on this episode, but I was very fascinated by this concept. And what really solidified this concept for me is the fact that Kate Mulgrew crushes it. She is so good playing the 2 versions of Janeway who are slightly different from each other. This is what fascinated me about this episode. That this wasn't like a parallel universe, an alternate timeline. We're talking a matter of hours of difference. So the main difference is one ship has gone through a lot of hardship and the other hasn't yet. And one ship has lost 2 crew members and the other hasn't. So that's really the only difference, is not this huge difference of timelines. So they're basically the same characters with a couple hours worth of difference in experience, couple key hours where important things happen, but still, it is so fascinating to address this and to be an actor to have to walk that line of playing these 2 different versions of the same character. Was amazing, and all the actors did a good job. But I put emphasis on Kate Mulgrew because there was a lot of Janeway and Janeway scenes together, Janeway and Janeway action, a lot of that happening, and she nailed it. It was so good. The scenes with the 2 Janeways are amazing. Also, I found the misdirect in this episode to be extraordinarily effective. I think a lot of times, especially in Star Trek, where they try to throw in a little misdirect to try to make you think one thing's going to happen and something else happens, usually it's predictable from miles and miles away. And maybe this was predictable from miles and miles away for some people, but I still think it's effective even if you could see it coming. And that is where the audience is led to believe that the crew that is all beat up and the ship that's falling apart and lost 2 crew members, that obviously that's going to be the one that has to go, because we know that both of these Voyagers cannot continue to exist. One of them is going to have to go, and in fact that Janeway says that she is going to self-destruct the ship. The other Janeway tries to talk her out of it. And this was a great scene too, where it was like, that I'm going to do this. You're me, so you can't talk me out of this. Oh, so good, so good. And so you're thinking that obviously, well, that's the ship that's going to go, but then things change because the Vidians end up attacking the ship that's in good shape, whereas the fucked up ship is safe from the Vidians, and it is actually what was the ship in good shape is now like being taken over by the Vidians, and they're the ones who end up going. And that was such an effective misdirect. It worked really well for me. And the fact that now that ship still has a Harry Kim and a baby Naomi. So the Harry Kim and baby Naomi from that ship go over to the other Voyager to replace the ones that died. And that's the wrong Harry Kim is on the Voyager. I mean, it doesn't matter for baby Naomi. She has no memory of it. But God, there's a Deep Space Nine episode coming later up in my top 25 that does a similar kind of thing that blows my mind. That I love. And oh my God, I do wish that they had brought it up again, and that's my ongoing issue with Voyager, that it is not serialized enough. It is too episodic, where something happens and oftentimes just gets disregarded. Like, it would have been cool if every once in a while Harry Kim was like, remember how like I had a completely different experience and different memories than the rest of you all? Like, what a mind fuck. So I'm not saying they bring it up every episode, but like, it'd be nice if it were referenced ever again. I think that really is my biggest complaint about this episode, is not from the episode itself, but what comes after. And what comes after is the ship is just magically fixed and everything is okay again. I mean, the ship was fucked up. Like, there were pieces of the roof laying on the bridge, and they don't have a Federation station to go to. You're telling me that there are people within the ship that are going to fix it, and they say, like, by the end of the episode, like, everything's nice again, and they say it was 3 days. Or am I misremembering that? Maybe they said that it would happen in 3 days, I think is what they said. But anyways, it took apparently 3 days to make the ship pristine again. Total bullshit. No. No, that ship should have been fucked up for a long time. And that's what bugs me about Voyager, is that it's just magic without to a starbase to get it really properly fixed up. Like, where did they get the parts? Like, no. So, but that is really, again, an issue that I have with the overall show, and future episodes that come after this, that they just don't follow up on things, that they just do hit the reset button every time, and that's always bothered me about Voyager. But that actually is not a mark against this episode itself. It's a mark against the franchise overall, and the episodes that come after this. Now, I do want to address some of the things I've heard about from the detractors. And I think the biggest thing that I've heard about is the junk science, that this whole concept is nonsense, and it takes people out of the story because it's just nonsensical and it's junk science. And my response to that, whenever I hear that critique of any episode, the alternative factor is another one where junk science is used as a reason for people hating that episode. And I don't love that episode, unlike my brother. My brother loves that episode. I'm more in the middle on it, but I don't think it's as terrible as other people do. But that junk science critique, the only response I can have to that is, have you watched Star Trek? The whole thing is based on junk science. It boggles my mind when people cherry pick certain things that bother them for some reason. Like, why does this junk science bother you than anything else in the entire series? The entire series is junk science. Secret to tell you guys, warp drive, junk science. The whole thing is in technobabble rules. Star Trek, it's all technobabble. It's all nonsense. We all have to suspend our disbelief. So I don't know, maybe certain people have reasons why this particular junk science is a bridge too far for them. Personally, I'm just so wrapped up in the amazing acting, the amazing story, the amazing concept, that I do not care about the junk science any more than I care about the junk science in every single other Star Trek episode in existence. So everyone has the right to their opinions, and I don't want to disrespect anyone else's opinions. I just have a hard time understanding that rationale, because why does this junk science bother you more than any other? I don't know. Personally, this is an amazing episode of Star Trek, and it is worthy to be in my top 25 at number 25. And now it is time to move on to number 24.
Number 24.
Okay, let's move on to my number 24, and it comes from Star Trek Enterprise. Now, 3 of the next 4 episodes in this top 25 come from Star Trek Enterprise's 3rd season, because I feel it's really important that that season in particular gets its due in my top 25. I think that is one of the best seasons in all of Star Trek, and it is certainly in the conversation as the best serialized season. You could probably put the latter half of season 7 of Deep Space Nine in that conversation. The beginning part of season 6 of Deep Space Nine is in that conversation. But this is actually really a season-long arc, so it is probably the best and deserves representation. However, it was a challenge to cherry pick episodes out to put them in this top 25 because of the continuing nature of the story, because of the fact that these episodes belong to a larger story arc. And what makes things more complicated is that certain episodes definitely go together. So this episode that I'm going to talk about, I'll just go ahead and tell you what it is, and then I'll talk more about the serialization of it all. My number 24 is Countdown, from the 3rd season of Star Trek Enterprise. This is the penultimate episode of the 3rd season, and all in all, it is what could be considered part 2 of a 3-part finale that is the Council Countdown in 0 Hour. So I made a decision, which I talked about in my intro video to the top 100, that I was going to count episodes that 2-parters that have the same title. So like Best of Both Worlds parts 1 and 2, In the Mirror Darkly parts 1 and 2. I don't know, I had a hard time thinking of another one. Time Zero parts 1 and 2, even though that didn't make my top 100. You get the the point. Those I was considering as one big movie. If they have the same title, they count as one episode. But if they have separate episode titles, then I was going to count them as individual episodes. Now that does create some complications, not only in Enterprise, but in Deep Space Nine's 7th season, which I'm going to get to a little bit later on in this video as well. But I had to do it that way because if I try to count those final 3 episodes, like I try to count the Council Countdown and 0 Hour all as one entity, then what else am I counting together? Like the waters get a little murky there, because personally I would put Azadi Prime and Damage as one big unit, and I know my brother would not. Which one of us is right, which one of us is wrong? It's none of us. It's our opinion. So it's just kind of the waters are murky there. Like, who is it to decide which 2 episodes and which 3 episodes go together within this larger serialized story? Like, I can't make that decision. So that's why it was just easier to do the clean cut. If they have the same title, they go together. If they have separate titles, they are separate. But doing it that way does make it weird to like cherry pick out this one part of a larger story, which is actually also a part of a 3-parter. But I'm going to do it. And it's like 3 of the next 4 episodes in this top 25 are that. But I'm going to make it work. So let's actually talk about my number 24, which is Countdown. So this is the penultimate episode of the 3rd season, and also I would say part 2 of that finale trilogy. So we've got the council, and then we have countdown, and then we have 0 hour. Now 0 hour I had way back at, I believe it was number 67, and the main reason it was further back than the other two was that it doesn't really have an ending. It goes into that silly season 4 time travel thingy that I wish it had more of a definitive ending, and then you could do the time travel thingy separately. And also like the cheesy Archer running away from the explosion scene that reminded me of like the $6 Million Man. But don't get me wrong, that episode is still in my top 100. And if I were to count these three together as one single unit, 0 hour would not it would be in the top 25. 0 hour would not push it out of the top 25. But when I look at them individually, 0 hour is way back there. And countdown is here. And spoiler alert, the council's coming up soon. So now, as for this particular episode, there's a lot of just tension that had been set up in the previous episode. This is the backdrop of, spoiler alert, Dagra's death, which I'll get to more when I get to that episode. But things are looking dire. Hoshi has been kidnapped. And then Archer has to find a way to communicate with the aquatics and convince them to help them, to help the Enterprise. And he no longer has his interpreter, and people are worried about her. And so there's all this dire. See, I love the direness. I love the tension. So that's all that. That's the backdrop of it. And then Hoshi crushes it in this episode. She is a badass. Now, eventually they do break her because they have to. Like, it would be unrealistic, I think, if she held out, because they present it like this is really powerful mind control, and if she was able to resist it to the end, I don't know that I would buy that. So of course, eventually, yes, she is going to succumb to it. But in the meantime, she's a fucking badass. Before they get to that point, I love how she, tries to trick them. After she's already been through a lot of that brainwashing, and she's in a really bad shape. So Hoshi's a character that was not utilized well throughout the Enterprise's run. She gets some really bad episodes in the earlier seasons and not developed particularly well. But she's a badass in this episode, even if she does ultimately succumb to their torture. But who wouldn't? So fucking love that about this episode. And then my favorite part of this episode is Archer having to confront the aquatics. And so they do work around the Hoshi thing by having them being able to like translate it into English. I was like, why didn't they do that before? But whatever, he has to be able to communicate with them. And the tension of this episode really is in dialogue rather than in action. And we get the action packed in the next episode, is 0 hour, which is great too. As again, it makes my top 100, maybe further back, but still makes my top 100. But the fact that the main source of tension in this episode, I think this is true of the council as well, which I'll get to a little bit later, is the dialogue. And in this case, Archer trying to convince the aquatics to join them, and he ultimately does it by going out on a limb and promising something he cannot actually in reality guarantee that he can deliver. So then it becomes pressure on Trip and T'Pol to follow through with what Archer promised and come up with this evidence that he said he had. And then that creates this tension between Trip and T'Pol. At this point, I actually do buy the Trip and T'Pol thing. I do. Like, I wasn't a big fan of it at first, but I think like the relationship does work for me here, and it creates extra tension between the two of them because they're the ones who have to try to figure out this thing that Archer promised the aquatics he doesn't actually have. So that whole thing is so intense and just makes for riveting television. And so ultimately, that is why I had to include Countdown as one of the Enterprise Season 3 episodes that I have to put in my top 25, because it is the perfect middle portion of it's really, if you look at the final three parts of the final three episodes of the third season, it is kind of like a little trilogy within itself. And the middle portion is always key. That is where the tension has to be the highest. That is where things look the most dire for our heroes. I mean, look at Empire Strikes Back as the ultimate in the middle part of a trilogy. I think the Countdown is effective in this little trilogy as well. I'm not saying it's equivalent to Empire Strikes Back, nothing is, but I think that in that role, it is extraordinarily effective, and that is why Countdown is in my countdown for the top 100, and in particular the top 25. It is a number 24. Now let's take a brief break from my Enterprise discussions to talk about an episode from Star Trek: The Next Generation.
23.
Okay, let's get into my number 23. As I said, it comes from Star Trek: The Next Generation, and it is from Star Trek: The Next Generation's 6th season, and it is Timescape. Timescape is my number 23. So it should be noted that the 6th season of Star Trek: The Next Generation has the most entries in my top 25. There are 4 episodes in my top 25 from that season, by far more than any other season. Actually, I think the next one would be Deep Space Nine's 6th season as well, which only has 3, and this one has 4. This one also, this season, has the most entries into my top 50 because I already had 2 in my top 50. We had Face of the Enemy and Frame of Mind were in my previous video, both made my top 50, also from that season 6 of The Next Generation. So there's 6 episodes in total in my top 50, 4 total in my top 25. I love this season of The Next Generation. So when it comes to Timescape, it's another one that I think I've learned later that maybe there are people who don't love it as much as I do, and I'm not going to address the detractors here. Like, if you don't love it, good for you. I don't understand you, but that's fine. I'm here to talk about why this is number 23 for me. So there are 2 elements of this episode that make it great for me, and that is 2 very important elements of any episode: plot and character. So plot and the character interactions, character chemistry in particular. So I'll start with talking about the plot, and there's really kind of 2 aspects of this plot that make it really great for me. It's the timey-wimey stuff that I always love when they do a good job of interesting timey-wimey stuff, and I think this one is innovative and engaging and interesting. So the timey-wimey aspect is really great, but all the other aspect of the plot is the interesting Romulan revelations, and continuing on with what they did in Face of the Enemy, as trying to show a little more complexity to the Romulans, that they're not just these evil mustache-twirly villains. And this was continued forward into Star Trek Picard, honestly. I think that's one thing Star Trek Picard does well. And Discovery, too, like showing different sides of the Romulans. I love it, and it starts here in season 6 of The Next Generation, and is highlighted in this episode. Now, as for the timey-wimey stuff, we have the concept is really interesting, where we have these different pockets of where time just freezes, and I love how we first see this, where Council Troy is sitting there chatting away with Data and Picard and Geordi, and then all of a sudden the 3 of them just freeze. and I thought about doing a gag where I just froze for a little bit in this review, but I just don't think that would work. But never mind. Anyways, I'm getting a little silly. Like another character gets silly later in this episode, which we'll get to. But it was a really good setup for the tension, for the mystery of this episode, to have that key scene happen in the very beginning. And I just kind of want to throw this out there too. It's interesting going back and watching this, having, 3 years under my belt now, living and interacting with the world as female, and how it really stands out to me how Council Tori as a woman feels compelled to gaslight herself when even trying to explain to these men. I mean, Data's technically an android, but he's in male form that that this thing happened, and they never say that they don't believe her. They do give these expressions of doubt on their faces, like, that I don't know, but that she just gaslights herself, like, well, we've all been under a lot of stress lately. There were times at this conference where I felt that time froze. Like, no, Counselor Troy, you're legitimate, but I understand existing in the world as a woman that you're gonna tend to do that and put the blame on yourself, even when the men were not actually, they didn't say anything, but I don't know, some of their expressions might have been interpreted by her. Oh, it must be me. I'm just the girl. It must be my problem. But it was interesting just viewing that, just seeing it in that context for me. Like, oh yeah, that's very true to life. Very true. Like, that's exactly how she would react. But then that is quickly resolved when she herself freezes. And I love that we see from her perspective now, that we're staying in Council Troy's perspective, that all of a sudden time has just passed and they are like, oh, you froze for a little while. Like, that was also extraordinarily effective. So all throughout they use this concept very effectively. Of course, we find the Enterprise. We see that Dr. Crusher has been shot, and if they put time forward again, she's going to die instantly, it appears. So again, you're really ratcheting up the tension to a high level, and also you're creating this mystery as what is going on here. And we did get the scene at the very beginning of the episode where they did lead us to believe that the Enterprise was going to confront the Romulans and that there was going to be this conflict. So we have that backdrop already, but we still don't know what is going on here, and it is very eerie. The whole thing of them walking onto the frozen Enterprise, and especially when you get to the scene with the frozen Dr. Crusher with the frozen disruptor going through her. I mean, chilling is a good word for all of this. But I also liked how they used this to misdirect us and to show that actually the Romulans aren't really the villains here, and actually no one is really the villain here. Once again, this is a trope that has been used quite a few times in Star Trek, where there are these aliens who are trapped in something, or their babies are trapped, but they end up causing harm to the crew in a desperate way to get out of it. I mean, there was an episode of Strange New Worlds that was similar to this recently, so it's a thing that Star Trek has done a bunch, but when done well, it works, and I thought it worked really well here, and I love that it was really actually the Romulans and the Enterprise were working together the whole time. So things were not as they appeared, and I loved how this mystery unfolded. That worked so extraordinarily well for me. Now, the other aspect, other than the plot, I wanted to talk about the character chemistry. Troy, Data, LaForge, and Picard. They worked so well together, and I love the beginning scene where the four of them are just sitting there chatting, and we get to see just like how far Jean-Luc Picard has come as a character from the first season, where he was very rigid and not opening up at all to his crew, and now he's at the point where he's telling this story about the one professor that he saw the speech of. He kept talking and talking in one long unbroken sentence. It was a joy to see Patrick Stewart and Jean-Luc Picard behaving that way, compared to what he used to behave around his crew, and it is earned. It just shows us like how far he's come, and I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed seeing these characters interact with each other. And lest I forget the smiley face, the most iconic scene from this episode. Now, maybe some people have a problem with it. I don't know, but it definitely, I will say, it's a weird scene. It's out of place. It doesn't seem to fit, but it works. So I'm talking, of course, of a scene where Picard goes a little bit mad and draws a little smiley face in the frozen warp core breach cloud and goes, a little wacky. But I think it actually is effective to raise the tension in this episode, even if it is a little bit of a comic relief simultaneously. It also shows us, oh, if they stay there too long, they're going to lose it and go a little mad. So I actually found it not only to be entertaining, but also effective for raising the tension. So, I mean, you can take or leave that scene. I think it's iconic either way. I think there's been a lot of memes made off of that scene, but I love it, and I think it works really well. And I think, again, the characters work so well in this episode together. It's just chef's kiss to this episode. That is why. I mean, really, all episodes in the top 25, chef's kiss, because that's why this is in my top 25. This is one of the all-time greats. And there are more to come from this great season of television later in my top 25. But first, we're going to get back to the Enterprise episode. So let us go ahead and move on to my number 22.
22.
All right, let's move on to my number 22, back into Star Trek Enterprise's third season. Number 22 is Damage. So I'm jumping around a little bit in this third season. It's weird. It's awkward. Like, I'm outside of that final three again. Go back a little bit earlier on in the season for Damage. This episode is a magnifique. It is amazing. It is exquisite. It is everything that I wanted a Voyager to be, but was not. So unlike the Voyager episode I talked about in my number 25, Deadlock, where after that episode is over, the Voyager is just magically fixed and is pristine again. This episode, the damage is carried over from the previous episode and then would carry forward a little bit beyond this episode. Now, they would fix up the ship, but it just isn't magically pristine again in the next episode. So, which is the way it should be. So, I will also say that the damage all around the characters all throughout this episode really adds to the tension. It really adds to the dire nature of the situation and adds more complexity to the decision that Archer makes, because which we'll get to, of course, a little bit later. But it does seem like he's doing a terrible thing, but you're constantly reminded of how dire their situation is with the set pieces, with the choices of makeup. So you have Archer still being bruised and beaten from his recent encounter with the Xindi. He just returns from that at the beginning of this episode. Well, throughout, he is visibly beaten. You have T'Pol being completely tweaked out from withdrawal symptoms. So that, too, adds to the dire nature of the situation. And then the sets are magnifique. You have just pieces of things falling everywhere. Things laying on the ground, and they're in the middle of a conference, and like shit starts falling from the ceiling. I mean, that kind of shit is what Voyager should have done more of. This is really adds to the tension, and I love how everything is dark. The lights aren't working, and there's also some really good editing choices with the lighting. There's a scene between Archer and Dr. Flux where Archer is first kind of, hinting at to Flux that he's going to make he's about to cross a line, is what he says. I'm about to cross a line. And this scene takes place entirely in the dark, and you can barely see Phlox and Archer in the shadows. And it only serves to add to the dark tension of the scene itself and the dialogue that is happening there, it really amplifies the dark feeling that you have and amplifies this kind of really dark decision that Archer is about to make. It is magnifique. It is so good. Then Archer has the conversation with T'Pau later in the episode. The scene's still in the dark, but we kind of get more of a wide view of Archer's quarters, so we can see the damage all around them. So it's not so focused on the dark screen as it is in the Archer and Dr. Flox scene, but we are, again, focusing on all the damage. And the episode, of course, called Damage. So we can't forget that, which I don't think is too on the nose. I don't think it's beating it in too much. I do think that all of that works. I think it all just reminds us of how dire the situation is, which makes Archer's decision that more complex. Now, as for the content of that conversation between T'Pol and Archer, you have T'Pol being, tweaked out from withdrawal symptoms, and Archer making a tough decision and making what could be easily deemed as an immoral decision, that he is crossing a line. You have that backdrop, and then the conversation that they have. I would put this at a close second to a certain Chakotay Janeway conversation that you will see much later in my top 25. I'm not going to tell you exactly where, but it's coming up a lot later. Where, as the best confrontational scenes between a captain and a first officer in all of Star Trek. Again, magnifique, because, again, like that upcoming Chakotay Janeway conversation, both of them are making good points. They're both kind of right and they're both kind of wrong, and that you can't, it's not very clear cut. And that's what makes the scene so incredible. And both actors so good. I didn't do a lot of chef's kiss on this top. Hey, this is the top 25. This is the best of the best. I'm going to be good. A lot of chef's kisses. Chef kisses for everyone. But especially with the actors in this scene is incredible. And again, I cannot overemphasize the setting, the damage, the darkness, all of that, the lighting, all of that is fan-freaking-tastic. And now, as for Archer's decision, I don't think it's as clear-cut as it might first seem. I don't even think this is as clear-cut as the one in Dear Doctor. I think in Dear Doctor, they absolutely made the right decision. And I had talked about that. That was back at number 59. This one, I mean, it seems really fucked up what Archer did. And everything that T'Pol says is absolutely true. And it's just fucked up. But you also understand the desperate nature, not only just from this particular episode, but you look at the wide view of the entire serialized story arc, where they're in a desperate state and they're trying to save Earth from being destroyed. So everything is at stake here. So you can kind of understand why Archer does this awful thing. Now, this is very BSG-like. BSG would come out like a couple years after this. BSG would kind of maybe overdo this a little bit, especially in the first season, as I felt like they did these like tough dilemma things a little too often. But when they did it well, it worked well for me. I just think they went to that. I almost said went to that well. I just said the word well a bunch of times. But anyways, I think they maybe did that a little too often in BSG. But I did love it when it worked effectively. And I think that that's what this reminds me of is that BSG really dark dilemma. And it's something Star Trek was afraid to go into. and they should have went into it more. And I think Voyager was trying too hard to avoid these types of things. And I think Voyager would have been better off if they went to it more, because when they did do it, like in that episode that I'll talk about later between Chakotay and Janeway, it really worked well. So let's talk about a couple other little aspects of this episode. Damar is in this episode. This is Casey Biggs, the guy who plays Damar. And honestly, the makeup that they use for the Illyrians here is not too dissimilar from Cardassian makeup. So it's like, oh, it's Damar. Like it's kind of like, I don't know, it was a little too similar. So I was like, oh, Damar, it's Damar. What's Damar doing here? He travels back in time. And he's now an Illyrian, pretending to be an Illyrian instead of a Cardassian. But his personality was the same too. But so that was kind of cool. Don't forget about Damar. He becomes important very shortly here in this top 25. But it's cool to see Casey Biggs there. A little too similar to Damar, though. Now, I just mentioned the Illyrians. Let's talk about this. This bugs me because this race of people in this episode are called the Illyrians, and the race of people that Una belongs to in Star Trek Strange New Worlds also called the Illyrians, but they are completely human appearing, and their big thing is genetic engineering. So people have always assumed, and they're always making the connection, that those two races are the same because they both are called the Illyrians. And other than the name, I see no connection between these two races. They look completely different. There's no mention of genetic engineering whatsoever here. And you would think that the Illyrians might mention, like, in that episode in Strange New Worlds when Una's on trial and she hires that lawyer who's kind of against the Federation, you would think she would mention, hey, the first time that we encountered them, they fucking ditched us in the middle of space. Like, you'd think that would come up. I don't know. But I just don't see a connection between these two species. So it bugs me that they're called the same thing. And then everyone just assumes it is the same species, even though there is zero connection between the two other than the name. So I wish this was clarified at some point. I don't know. This bugs me. I kind of think that they accidentally called Una's race the Illyrians, not realizing that there already was an Illyrians out there, and everyone is just taking this as face value as, oh, it's the same people, even though they have absolutely nothing in common. But anyways, that has really nothing to do with anything. That does not take away from this episode at all. To me, one of the greats, and I like when Star Trek is able to delve into those dark places and do it effectively. I know that's not for everybody, but I think that when they do it well, it is magnificent. I think they also try it and don't do it well. There was an episode of Strange New World season 2 that I think didn't do the darkness very well. Was the Under the Cloak of War episode. I think it kind of fell short. But when episodes of Enterprise and Deep Space Nine and occasionally even Voyager go into that dark place and they do it effectively, it is incredible storytelling, and it ends up being one of my favorite episodes. So there we are. My number 22 in all of Star Trek is Damage from Star Trek Enterprise. Now let's go on to my number 21 and one more episode of Enterprise.
Number 21.
Okay, so now let's get to my number 21 from Star Trek Enterprise once again. Number 21 is The Council. So this is the first part of the 3-part finale. So I kind of have them in reverse order throughout my top 100, where the third part is the lowest rank, was back at number 67. And the second part you just saw at number 24 not too long ago. And the first part is actually my favorite episode in that ending trilogy. It is my favorite episode in season 3 of Star Trek Enterprise, and in fact, it is my favorite episode in the entire Star Trek Enterprise series. and I did a top 20 favorite episodes of Enterprise a few months ago, and this was my number one. So this is my absolute favorite episode of Enterprise. So let's talk about that for a minute first. Let's talk about the fact that this is my absolute favorite episode in the entire series of Enterprise, and yet here it is only at number 21, which indicates that my entire top 20 is void of Enterprise episodes. So why is that? Well, let's say you don't like Enterprise, you hate it, you think it sucks, that's why you don't have any in your top 20. No, in fact, in ranking the original 5 shows, the 5 legacy shows, I actually have Enterprise in 4th place over Voyager. I have Voyager last. So that is not the case at all. But the reason why there are no Enterprise episodes in my top 20 is because I did not have as much history with Enterprise. I did not grow up with it. I did not sit with it as much. And that is true. With each successive series after The Next Generation, I have less and less of an emotional attachment to. So Next Generation was my baby. I mean, TOS is what I saw first when I was a little kid. But as far as what I came to age with, Next Generation aired, I believe, from I was age 13 through age 20 in my life. So I literally grew up. I came of age watching The Next Generation. So I have the absolute most emotional attachment to that show. And that is reflected in the fact that you will see in my top 20 that The Next Generation fucking dominates. It dominates my top 20. It dominates. Not that there aren't Deep Space Nine and Voyager and little TOS thrown in, but The Next Generation dominates. And that is why. And then the probably the series you will see second most in my top 20 is Deep Space Nine, because I have the second most physical, emotional. I said physical, kind of physical. I guess, I don't know, because it moves me physically. Like it elicits a response. I don't know, emotional response really. So an emotional attachment, nostalgia. Deep Space Nine would be second, and then Voyager is interesting because there are a lot of episodes. Most of the episodes I don't have an attachment to, but there are a few select ones, like Deadlock that I did at number 25, and like the ones that are upcoming in my top 25 that I have a lot of attachment to. And I honestly don't have that kind of history or attachment with any Enterprise episode. So this admiration that I have for season 3 comes later in life. So that is why Enterprise does not break my top 20. Now that I've gotten all that out of the way for like 4 minutes, let's get into the actual episode of the Council and why this is the greatest Enterprise episode for me and why it is the highest ranked episode for me. And it is all the way up at number 21. That is no small potatoes, being number 21 of all of the Star Trek franchise. So for me, though this is not the finale, this is the episode that we had been building toward throughout this season. Particularly going back a few episodes, they were trying to get to this council. And this is where it was all going to come to a head, and it really delivers. It really lives up to all the buildup, all the hype, more than I could have ever imagined. And again, like as I mentioned with Countdown, I think the tension in this episode comes from dialogue rather than action. And whenever that can be effective, I will always admire that and always prefer that. And in particular, there's some verbal confrontations that happen. I mean, there's a little bit of physical altercation, but mostly it's the verbal confrontations. And we knew that this was coming, but seeing it on screen was better than the anticipation. So when you anticipate something, if they're able to deliver better than something that's better than what you expected, that's amazing. So we have actually two different council scenes. The first one being really intense with everyone just kind of completely disregard, not everyone, but the expected parties, the insectoids and the reptilians, just completely disregarding Archer's very existence, not even validating his right to even be in that council room, never mind paying attention to any of his words. And then you have those other species that are kind of in the middle, like let's hear him out. And then you have the aquatics, you don't know where they stand yet. We get that big aquatic scene, as I mentioned in the next episode. So the tension is palpable. It is just, it is so good. And then things just fall apart. We have the insectoids attacking Degra, and everything looks to shit. Now, we have another council scene later in the episode where the tension is high for a different reason, because the reptilians now have suspiciously done a 180 and completely turned around, and the characters are buying it. And we, the audience, know that this is bullshit because we have seen the scenes of the reptilians talking to the what are those people? I want to call them the founders. The founders is from Deep. They're kind of very similar to the founders in their appearance. What were those people called? I don't know. I'll think of it later. But yeah, somebody will write a comment, but I will already have come up with it. So don't even bother writing a comment. Yeah, so anyway, those dudes. So we've already seen them talking to them, and like we already know that the reptilians are still very much against Archer and the Enterprise, and still very much want to set off the weapon. So when we see them suddenly change their minds in the council meeting, we know that they're full of shit. But the tension comes in. What are they up to? Were they really doing? What is going to happen next? That is where the tension came from, and that was equally as effective as the first council scene. And then we get the scene toward the end of the episode that I think really probably puts this over the top for me as the best episode in Enterprise and the highest ranked in my top 100. And that is the scene where the reptilian captain, the reptilian leader, puts a knife in Degra. I mean, I don't know how to say it. It was a shocking scene. Was it not that it was surprising that he would do that, but that it just kind of came out of nowhere. And in Star Trek, you don't expect characters that we have such an emotional attachment to be killed. And Degra, while not a member of the Enterprise crew, he is a character that was very well developed over the course of the previous, like maybe 8 or 9 episodes or so, or 10 episodes. I don't remember how many, but a very well developed character, a very interesting, intricate, complex character, one who we see the crew, some members of the crew have complex feelings about. We see that Trip blames him for his sister's death, and we see that Degra is generally a good person and cares about his own children and has his own personality and his own motivations, and is a character that we really grew to love and to care about and become attached to. And to see a character like that get a knife in Star Trek is kind of shocking. Even if the fact that the reptilians would do that is not shocking, but seeing it was shocking. And I love how Scott Bakula plays it, how Archer is clearly affected by this death, but he has to keep his eye on the ball. He has to keep his head in the game. He has to save Earth and stop this weapon from going off. But you can see the conflict. You can see how that it affects him, which honestly is something that Star Trek often does not do a good job at. Oftentimes, deaths that should affect characters don't, and they just kind of like whatever, metaphorically step over a body and continue forward with their day. Whereas here you can visibly see how much it affects Archer, and that is very powerful. And Scott Bakula again powerful performance. You know, he gets a lot of flack as an actor, and maybe he's not the best actor overall in the world, but in some of these episodes, he just really crushes it. And this is one of them. So this episode, the way that it is able to create tension in unconventional ways, and the way that it really delivers from all of the anticipation and buildup that led into it, it is what makes it, to me, the best episode of Enterprise, and clearly deserving to be in my top 25 at number 21. And now we can move away from Enterprise as we get into my top 20.
Number 20.
Okay, let us move into the top 20. And believe you me, that Next Generation domination will start very shortly. However, at number 20, we're going to dip into Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the 7th season of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. My number 20 is Tacking into the Wind. Now, in a moment, I'll explain to you the plot of this episode, because you might be like, Tacking into the Wind, which one was that again? And that is kind of an issue with this episode, is that it is part of that elongated, serialized story arc about the Dominion War, and it kind of just fits right in there. And I understand it can be hard to pick out certain episodes, other than, of course, the finale, which appeared already earlier in my top 100. It was in the last video. The Vic Fontaine factor is what prevented that from being in my top 25. This episode, the only thing that's holding it back from being even higher than number 20, the only thing holding it back from being like in my top 15 or even top 10, is the fact that it does kind of blend into that overall story arc, and it's hard to kind of pick it out from the other episodes. But other than that, this episode is a goddamn masterpiece. So this episode is the one that has an incredible A plot and B plot. And in fact, in all of Star Trek, I think this has the best A plot, B plot combination ever. At any Star Trek episode of any of the Star Trek franchise. It also has a C plot, but the C plot is really just kind of setting up for the next episode, which is the Bashir and Brian and the Bashir and O'Brien and the whole Section 31 thing. So the C plot sets up for that. But the A plot and B plot, or really the two A plots, are both absolutely fucking phenomenal. What I would probably call the A plot would be the plot where Damar and has to make a choice between the Federation and his old Cardassian buddies. And in this plot, his Cardassian second in command dude is kind of threatening Kira, turning against Kira, and there's a lot of tension there. And in the end, Damar has to make a choice. What I guess you would call B plot, but would be an A plot in any other episode, is Worf challenging Galron. And there's a lot of build up to that. So that is the episode that I'm talking about, in case you don't remember which one this is. This has the best A plot, B plot combination in Star Trek, as I said. They are both absolutely phenomenal. And so I'll start with that Damar plot, what I guess you would probably have to consider the A plot. Yeah, he's trying to decide between his loyalty between his old Cardassian friends or to the Federation. And there is a really powerful line in this episode where Damar discovers that the Dominion have killed his family, and he's like, what kind of people do this? What kind of people kill civilians to make a point? What kind of monsters are they? What kind of people do this? And Kira says, yeah, Damar, what kind of people would do a thing like this? Like referring to the Cardassians and how they treated the Bajorans. Damar gives her an angry look and just kind of walks off. And then Kira kind of does like Chris Farley. She's like, "Oh, stupid, stupid, stupid!" Shouldn't have said that. And then Garrick has the line where he says, "If he's the man we think he is, if he's the man we need him to be." I don't know why I'm making Garrick talk like William Shatner. Forget my Garrick impression. Anyway, he says, "If he's the man we think he is, if he's the man we need him to be, then this will only help him, not hurt him. This will make him stronger," or something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing here. That he will think about this, he will internalize this, and he will do the right thing. And he did need to hear that. So you did the right thing by telling him that. It was such a powerful moment. And then, of course, then we have this tension build up where they're trying to do this kind of heist thing. And I don't always like the heist type of storylines. Bada bing, bada bang. Excuse me. But this episode uses that heist kind of theme to perfection. And it has this really Quentin Tarantino-esque scene at the end, although Quentin Tarantino is just ripping off old Japanese movies, but still, we know it as a Quentin Tarantino type of moment where everybody is pointing guns at each other. It gets really intense. And we hear that Damar has fired a phaser, and we don't see the result of that right away, which, I mean, we know what choice he's going to make, but he's not going to shoot Kira. But it's still, the tension was really high, and it was really perfectly executed as Damar executes his friend. And then he has a line like, "He was my friend, but his Cardassia is gone." It's so good. And Damar makes the right choice. Even though some of the Cardassians might perceive that as him betraying his people for the Federation, he is doing what ultimately he thinks is going to be best for the Cardassian people. It was so powerful, so good. And so that was the A plot. And the B plot, or A plot part 2, was like the other A plot, really, is Cisco and Worf starting to realize, we need to do something about Galron, because Galron is intentionally sending Martok off on these missions of failure for political purposes, to make Martok look bad. And it is threatening the entire Alpha Quadrant, Galron's political motivations. Now, this is back to the Galron that was established way back in The Next Generation. I felt that the season 4 version of Galron was out of character. I could not really pinpoint what his political motivations were for turning against the Federation. It seemed like he was shooting himself in the foot. And Galron has always been one who is a politician and will put his political ambitions above everything else. So this is getting back to the Galron we know and hate or love, or however you feel about him. And this is a problem. And the episode beautifully follows Worf's dilemma between his loyalty to Martok, who says, no, we can't. Are you crazy? We can't overthrow Galron. He's our leader. We have to do whatever he says. And Worf initially wanting to go along with that. But I love that it's Ezri who gives him the correct advice. Ezri saying, I have a little more skeptical view of the Klingon Empire than Jadzia did, or Curzon did. And she tells him the hard truth about the Klingon Empire, that it's dying, and that if he doesn't do something about it, nobody's going to. And so that leads up to the scene where Galron once again is sending Martok off on a suicide mission. And Martok's going to go along with it, and everybody's going to go along with it. And Worf stands up and says, "No, we are not doing that." Kelron's like, "What? How dare you?" And I stood up and cheered. I'm like, "Yes, Worf!" and then they get in a fight. Now, it is a very short-lived fight. It isn't like a long, drawn-out thing, and that's fine, because when Worf puts the knife in Kelron, I stood up and cheered again. Yes, Worf! and then, of course, Martok tries to put the big robe on Worf and make him the leader, and Worf's like, no. There's only one man who can lead us, and that is Martok. And then Martok becomes the new leader of the Klingon people, and it was like stand up and cheer worthy. And this is the same episode as that powerful Damar storyline. That is why this episode is in my top 25. That is why it is number 20. This is the best A plot, B plot combination in all of Star Trek. It is phenomenal. It is a damn near masterpiece, if not for the fact that it's kind of just obscured in that whole big long story arc, and it's hard to cherry pick which episode is which. This would be even higher on my list than it is. But as it is, it does make my top 20 in all of Star Trek. So tacking into the win from Star Trek Deep Space Nine is number 20. Now let's move into that next generation domination.
Number 19.
All right, now let's get into my number 19, and thus begins the next generation domination. So in my top 19, 8 of those will be the next generation. Almost half, not quite half. Now, if that doesn't sound like domination to you, keep in mind that we're only choosing from 4 Star Trek series here. I already said Enterprise is off the table. So out of the 4 Star Trek series to choose from, 8 out of 19 are from the next generation. And you will find even more domination in the top 5, but that's later to come. My number 19 is an episode that I actually may have a little lower ranked than a lot of other people. I feel like this would be common in a top 10 or even top 5 of all of Star Trek. But I have it just a little bit further back at number 19. And so my number 19 from the 5th season of The Next Generation is The Inner Light. Now, I don't know. It's probably picking nits to try to explain why I have this all the way back at number 19. Number 19 is in my top 25. Again, in the top 25, chef kisses all around. So I shouldn't feel like I have to defend the placement here. But I did actually have it initially ranked a little higher and kicked it back a little bit. And I think the primary reason is that it does take away from completely all of our other characters and focus solely on Picard. And there is another episode like that that I had to rank higher. So you'll see that in the next video. There's another episode that kind of focuses only on Picard that I find a little bit more engaging, a little bit more interesting. This episode can drag a little, and I think my initial reaction when I very first saw it was that it was boring. But then the more I watched it, the more I just realized how incredible this episode is. Of course, there's the acting of Patrick Stewart, who is phenomenal in this episode. But also, I think I just became more and more fascinated by this concept of living an entire lifetime in 20 minutes and how that would impact the person. And I do like that they do, he busts out the flute every once in a while after this. Like, they don't really follow up on it, but they show you that, this is a thing that happened to him. And what a mind-blowing thing to happen to somebody But I think what I love about this plot most is how it is presented. Because in the beginning, Picard is very adversarial. He's like, "Who are you? What have you done with me? Why have you captured me?" And I think we as the audience would probably assume he has been captured and we're not going to trust these people. So I love how this episode is able to simultaneously have the characters gain Picard's trust while they're gaining our trust as well. And we're starting to realize, no, actually, these are good people. These are really good folk. And they actually don't mean him any harm. And we grow to love them as Picard does, and we grow to follow Picard's life and get attached to it and feel for them and feel for Picard in his new life. And that is quite an accomplishment. It really spits in the face of the trope of some insidious plot, which is what we would assume in a Star Trek episode. And it fights back against that trope brilliantly and creates an episode where we love the characters and we become attached to this life that Picard has. And that makes the reveal at the end, this has all happened in 20 minutes, just even that much more powerful. Now, I got to push back against, I've heard comparisons to the original series episodes Paradise Syndrome and saying that episode was like the original series version of The Inner Light. No, not even remotely close. If you've watched my channel before, you may know that I have the Paradise Syndrome as my number 3 and the worst of the original series. I absolutely hate that episode. And to compare it to The Inner Light is to not understand The Inner Light and what makes it great. Because what makes it great is the real relationships and friendships that Picard develops with these people in such a short period of time that feel tangible, that feel real. He really loves his wife. He really loves his daughter. He really thinks of Bataille as a good friend. Like, it's palpable, it's real. Whereas the Kirk and with that American Indian woman that is totally phony, no depth, very, very shallow. And I don't even understand why people even call that a love story. There is no love there. It is extremely shallow, and it is an insult to The Inner Light to compare that piece of shit, shallow, no real love, nothing type of episode to this very deep episode where Picard absolutely develops a real relationship over a short period of time by our watching. It's in the span of an episode, and that, I think, more than anything, is what makes this episode really great. And of course, there's Patrick Stewart's acting as well. If you're going to focus on just one of the characters, then it should be Picard, because Patrick Stewart is the best actor. And when I say just focus on one of the characters, obviously all the other characters get their own episodes. But with this one and another one that I'm going to get to in my next video, the other characters are barely in it. It's just all Picard all the time. We only see the other characters. They're trying to revive Picard a little bit here and there, but this is mainly all Picard. And Patrick Stewart would really have to carry an episode like that, and he's good enough to do it. So I do have a nitpick about this episode, and it does not hurt the episode. It is just something that I have learned to like suspend disbelief and go, well, whatever, it's Star Trek. It's an episode. I'll let it pass. So I don't think it holds the episode back in any way. However, I do feel compelled to bring it up. So this probe was wandering for 1,000 years. And we know that it did not attach itself to anyone before Picard, because once it's done with Picard, it shuts down. Like, it stops working, and they were able to bring it into the ship and find the flute in there. So that means for sure that in 1,000 years, this probe was wandering through space and never encountered anyone else that it attached to. Unless the implication here is that they were somehow some sort of prophets, and they could see 1,000 years into the future and know that some dude named Jean-Luc Picard was going to come on some ship, and they were like, that guy specifically, and only that guy. Like, I don't know. I think it could have stood for some sort of explanation that the probe was seeking for certain DNA or certain like a certain character or something. I don't know, but it just seems ridiculously improbable that the probe would not attach itself to anyone in 1,000 years unless it got stuck in some meteor shower or something. It was just bouncing off of meteors or got stuck in a black hole or something. I don't know. Again, this is a nitpick. It does not do any harm to the standing of this episode. It is not why I might have it slightly lower than other people. It has nothing to do with that. But I do feel compelled to point it out. That's all. Anyways, that is all I have to say about my number 19. The Inner Light, maybe not as high as others, but still remember this, chef's kiss. Now let us move on to the final entry in this video, and that will be my number 18, also from The Next Generation.
Ladies and gentlemen, number 18.
Okay, let's get into my number 18 to close off part 1 of my top 25 in August. And if you've seen the screen name below, you already know what the episode is, so I will not wait any longer. It is number 18, Parallels, from the 7th season of The Next Generation. The 7th season is an interesting season because it has 2 entries in my top 25, another one coming up later. Those are the only 2 episodes of the entire season that I think are any good. I think the rest of the season is mediocre in a best case scenario, and there's a lot of garbage in that season. I feel like the writers were grasping for straws or throwing darts at the proverbial dartboard and seeing what would stick. And I think it only stuck twice in that season, and this was one of them. They struck brilliance in this episode. So yeah, there's 2 in my top 25, and the rest of the season sucks or is mediocre at best. Parallels is an episode that finally tackles the subject of parallel universes beside the mirror universe, which I think was very important for the franchise to do, because it did always make it sound like the mirror universe was the only parallel universe, and of course it isn't. Now, how does this concept fit in with the mirror universe? I would say that you could postulate that the mirror universe, it would be many jumps away. Like when Worf is jumping from one to the next, to the next, to the next. The mirror universe is way far off, but somehow a bridge opened up between those, directly to those 2 worlds. And I think that was even described in Star Trek Discovery, that is what happened. So at Star Trek Discovery, actually in season 4, what was the name of that antagonist dude? he tells Book about this other universe he's trying to get back to, and Book is like, the mirror universe, and he's like, what, like, you think that's our only choice? And I appreciate that they did that, because it's another reminder that, yeah, the mirror universe is actually not the only parallel universe. It's apparently the one that we have the most direct bridge to from our universe. But there are many others, and that is what this episode explores. And if you know me, you know that I love parallel universe episodes. I fell in love with the whole concept when I first learned of it back in Mirror Mirror, which is another episode you'll see later on in my top 25 at some point. So this concept of every little choice that we make causing another universe has always been fascinating to me. I remember in high school trying to read Jorge Luis Borges in Spanish, and it was very difficult. It was very difficult to read, even in English. But The Garden of the Forking Paths, and that whole concept has always absolutely fascinated me. So this episode I found to be fucking genius. and the reason why it really works is that it starts off very subtle and builds and builds builds until we get to, hey, Riker's the captain, Wesley Crusher's the security officer, Worf is the first officer, and like, boom, we're like way different than the original Enterprise that we started with, and then boom, the whole area of space is filling up with Enterprises from all, like, that was nutso. Like, that was crazy. And I love the build up to that. I mean, that's honestly, that's kind of what I like in my fiction and my music, a good build and climax. That's kind of why I like Fish, because that's what they do really well. Start off slowly, build, and rocket. Like, I kind of love that and everything. So, yeah, I mean, the way that the story was delivered was perfection, and also all of the concepts presented are absolutely fascinating. And I love how they played with, what if scenarios with the Borg, where we end up on a ship where Captain Picard was killed by the Borg and Riker has been captain. And then we see the haunting image of the ship from the Borg universe with the grisly Riker, like, please don't make us go back into our universe. And they, fire a half-ass phaser shot and destroy them. Makes me wonder how they weren't already destroyed, if that's all it took to destroy them, or whatever. It still made for a great scene. It was a really haunting scene. And I also really appreciate that they made Worf the main character for this and not another Riker or Picard episode. I think Worf was actually the perfect choice for this, because he's such a fish out of water. He wouldn't be one, or Data would be another one. If you made him the main character, like, he would be more scientifically minded, he'd be more apt to think of something like this, whereas Worf, this is out of his wheelhouse. This is not something that would occur to him, so it would and I think the audience is writing right along with him, where we're just like, what is going on here? So I love Worf as the protagonist in this episode. He was the perfect fit. Now, some might complain about the Worf and Counselor Troy romance in this episode. While the Worf and Counselor Troy romance was absolutely abysmal overall, I would say this is actually the one episode where it works. And the reason why it works is because it's not actually our Prime Worf and Prime Counselor Troy who are together. They're alternate versions of Counselor Troy who have gotten together with alternate versions of Worf. And those alternate universes, maybe they actually have chemistry. So that actually works for me, because I can buy that there will be other universes where Worf and Counselor Troy make sense as a couple. The way it should have ended, though, was, oh, isn't that crazy? Like, these other universes where we were together, like, good thing we don't actually have chemistry in this universe. That's the end of that. But unfortunately, they used this episode to build upon it and try to force feed a relationship that just didn't work in our universe. It works fine in parallel universes, but not ours. They don't have good chemistry. But anyway, this is the one episode where that relationship does work, because they're alternate versions of Troy. So that does not hold this episode back for me. And I do think that this is an episode that a lot of people wouldn't have higher than The Inner Light. But this is my top 25, my top 100. And just because I've always been so fascinated with parallel universes and that concept, and that they finally did one that stepped outside of the mirror universe and did it so well, that this absolutely is a top 20 episode for me in the entire Star Trek franchise. So that closes out my video of my number 18. So you only have to wait one more week to get the next portion of my top 25. That would be my numbers 17 through 11, and that will be dropping for you next week, and you will see the further next generation domination. And then next month in September, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but next month we jump into the top 10. I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of next week's video. So I will see you then. Please subscribe if you have not already. Check out all of my other videos. You can also look in the description below to see the previous up to number 26, the previous top 100. Also, I will put timestamps below for each number. I mean, it's probably too late for me to tell you at this point at the end of the video, but you'll figure it out. Anyways, I will see you all very soon. Goodbye.